people ask me the meaning of life or what keeps me going, I would say I want to make the world a better place, or I want to contribute to making the world a better place. I want to minimize suffering and maximize well-being on Earth.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back, everyone, for episode 30. My guest today is chair of the Americas Working Group at the International Humanist and Ethical Youth Organization. He is also a web developer and blogs at ghostlessmachine.com. He was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and currently lives and works in Bucharest, Romania. He was kind enough to carve out some time out of his day to share with me his deconversion story. I knew Brazil was a very Catholic country, but what I didn't know and what he talks about is how Spiritism, reincarnation, and out-of-body experiences play a really big role in the faith of the people of Brazil. When he was younger, he was really interested in out-of-body experiences and wanted to have one himself. This leads to him asking lots of questions and looking into the practice further, and that's where the story gets interesting. It was a fascinating and unique story of deconversion. This is part one of my conversation with Ariel Pontes. All right, Ariel, thanks so much for joining me today. I'd like to just start off with, if you could just talk about the organization that you're a part of and what your involvement with it is like.
Okay, so the organization is IHEYO, or International Humanist and Ethical Youth Organization. It's a mouthful, but we're trying to change that. And we're the youth branch of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is also rebranding. And well, basically, we try to promote humanism worldwide. And yeah, we are a network of local NGOs that work with humanism around the world.
Do you know how long it's been in how long it's been an organization?
That's a good question. The IHEYO, the International Humanist and Ethical Union, has existed for quite a while, although I don't remember the exact date. I know that the first Declaration of Amsterdam was written in the 50s, and it was when network first, when the network first was assembled, but it was quite small back then, and there were a couple of organizations in Western Europe and the US only, I think, but then it grew, and I don't know, it's a good question, when the youth branch appeared.
It's been around for a long time, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Longer than I would think, yeah. Well, I always ask people what term they prefer to use when they identify, as far as religion goes. So do you consider yourself atheist, agnostic, humanist? What term do you prefer when talking to people?
Well, I am an atheist, so I don't have any problem avoiding this term, and I think it's somewhat important to me to not avoid it. Yeah, I don't want to give in and because I've noticed, especially in the United States, there's a lot of people who avoid the term because of the stigma, and I am more provocative, so I want to use the stigmatized term. But atheist is not very expressive of anything. It's just really a very punctual fact that you don't believe in God, and that's it. So humanist is more of a rich term, and I usually, when I talk about religion, I bring the term humanism a lot, and so that people learn more about it, etc. Yeah. So yeah, I would identify as both a humanist and an atheist.
If someone says, what's a humanist, what is a humanist to you?
Yeah, that's a complicated one, and it's funny because it's such a basic question, and when we go to conferences and stuff like that, all humanists, when they ask questions, they struggle to come up with a short sentence. I say that a humanist is the person who subscribes to the humanist movement, which is a movement that promotes secular values, basically, that promotes tolerance and universal ethics, or ethics that are not, that promotes less divisiveness, or a less divisive society that is based on something we have in common instead of based on tribalistic texts and stuff like that.
Let's jump into your story a little bit. So, how did Christianity or religion influence your childhood?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I'm from Brazil, and in Brazil, I was baptized Catholic, and my family was, well, they call themselves Catholic. But in Brazil, and especially in some regions, so I'm from Rio, well, in my experience at least, Christianity there is quite non-conventional. I mean, the Catholics, people say they're Catholics, but in my family, for example, everybody believed in reincarnation and talking to spirits and all sorts of stuff like that. There is a religion which is not so organized, but it's called Spiritism. In Brazil, it's based on the work of a French author, Allan Kardec. Actually, this name is actually not his real name. This is the name of the spirit that talks through him.
Wow.
So all his books are psychographed. I think that's how I say it. He has this book, I think it's like 19th century, and he has this book, the Book of the Spirits, and it's very, very influential in Brazil.
Interesting.
And so, yeah. And a lot of people would say they're Catholics, but basically they believe in Spiritism.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I talked to someone who was from Nigeria, and she was talking about how like witches and stuff like that is infused into their Christianity in Nigeria. Yeah. And I was like totally brand new to me. I'd heard people mention things like that before, but hearing her talk about how her parents infused that kind of into their faith. So that's really interesting. So they kind of infused kind of a this spiritual type.
In Brazil there is a lot of syncretism, especially because of all the slaves. There were a lot of slaves that were brought to Brazil. I think one of the countries with most slaves. I don't know. We compete, I think, probably only with the U.S. on that. I don't know exactly the numbers. We are also the last country to abolish slavery, if I remember correctly. And there's a strong, there's a strong African culture in Brazil. And one of the things is the religion and dances and stuff like that. And the Catholics were somewhat, let's say, not so aggressive. At one point, they stopped being so aggressive with the conversion, I think, and they started to tolerate an amount of syncretism. So, for example, there's a lot of African deities. There's a lot of saints. I think the fact that also Catholics have lots of saints helps because there is a lot of saints in Brazil. If you ask a Catholic what this saint represents, they will tell you something. And they say, this saint represents this. You pray for this saint when you want that. And when you try to say, but why? And you start reading and looking up the origin, it turns out that it's not because of anything Christian at all. It's because the slaves used those images of saints to actually worship their deities. And their deities were, for example, the goddess of the sea is the most famous one. And also in Catholics, you have this, I forgot how you say, a shrine of Mary.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, like different Marys, which is something very weird, never really understood. So the Virgin Mary of this place, the Virgin Mary of another place, and it's always like there's a short story of a miracle that icon performs, and then it becomes a thing. And there's the patron saint of Brazil is Maria Aparecida, or the one shrine of Mary, and she was found in the sea by fishermen. And I've heard this. I don't even know how official it is, but I at least heard the story that she was very dirty and black, and she was found by, I think, some black fishermen or something like that. And they tried. I don't remember who she was found by, but anyway, they tried to clean it off, and when it was white, they put it in a place. But then the next morning, it was black again. So it's sort of the African community, sort of like the Afro-Brazilian community, sort of adopted this saint, and somehow honoring this saint, like it was declared the patron saint of Brazil.
Interesting.
Anyway, it's a crazy story, but I have an aunt, also a great aunt, who was, for example, actually taught catechism in the church, and she believed that she was drowning in the sea once, and she was saved by the goddess of the. I mean, she would say the queen of the sea, because she's because monotheism, but really it's basically she believes in an African goddess. Basically.
Wow. But she's Catholic. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Exactly. So that's how I grew up. And my grandfather was the most religious person in the family, and he wasn't even baptized Catholic, so he was a Spiritist. But I mean, he didn't say Spiritist, but nowadays he says esoteric Christianity. But that has also lots of branches. He was in a Rosicrucian. I don't know if you've heard of this. Rosicruz.
I don't think so.
I think it's Rosicrucianism. But basically it has a lot of Spiritism in it. And now he is an even more obscure sect, so I don't even know the name anymore. But basically it's Asian religions and karma and reincarnation and the cycle of reincarnation and samsara, all of that adapted to a Christian public. So there's the idea that there's only one God, and there is an original sin, which is us departing from God. But it's all the Bible is interpreted in a very metaphorical sense. And so we depart that's what I learned. So that's what I believed when I was growing up, is that there is a God, and we lived in perfection, but then God gave us free will, and we departed from God. But we departed, some departed more, some departed less. I guess some people stayed there, but a lot of souls, let's say, departed quite far, and we are somewhere in the middle. I don't know, there are several layers. I mean, Earth, I don't even know what I thought, if I asked myself, how bad is it here, and how many layers are there, like, below us, until you get to hell, which is probably the worst possible place, and how many layers are there until you get to the best place ever. You also learn that you could reincarnate into a lower animal if you're really bad, like a dog or a cockroach, or something like, if you're really bad. And then maybe even another dimension in which there's more suffering or whatever. I don't know.
So this was part of your growing up, part of your understanding of what Christianity was, or was it just this unique thing that your grandfather believed?
I believed all this, yes. And if people asked, I would say I'm a Christian, which I didn't realize that there was a lot of contradiction in this. And also, but very, very quickly, I stopped saying I was a Christian. I realized that I learned more about Christianity, and I learned that these things are really not from the Bible, and I don't get it. And so I stopped saying I was a Christian. I said, I don't know. I'm spiritual, but not religious. I had this.
How old were you when you made that transition?
That's a good question. I was, I don't know, like my early teens, like 14 maybe.
Okay. Well, that sounds about the time that, people start to question the things their parents taught them. Yeah.
I was too young a kid before I to even use any label for myself, to even talk about. Nobody asked me before that age, like, oh, what's your religion?
No, exactly. That's kind of, that sounds
so yeah,
right.
Around that time. So basically the first time I kind of felt like I had to fill a form or something like that, or even it was probably on social media, actually on Orkut. It was a social media that was very popular in Brazil. Oh. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was Google's first social network, first attempt of a social network. And they had, in the form, they had religion. And I was like, it was probably influenced, made me think a lot. It's like, what's my religion?
Yeah, then you start looking into the doctrines. So is that what you did? You just started to research what Christianity was, or did it just kind of you figured it out? Or
I learned from school too. I mean, I knew, I didn't realize that that's the thing, because the way these people, the Spiritists, say, it's like, for them, there's no contradiction between Christianity and this. And I mean, it's true in a way, because it's so open to interpretation in the Bible anyway. Like, any coherent interpretation of the Bible is cherry picking to one level or another.
Yeah.
And so they cherry picked the Bible in a way that's compatible with what they believe. And I think that's, legitimate as any other interpretation. And yeah, so I believed in all these things, and I didn't think they were contradictory with Christianity.
Did you feel like, I always ask people this, and I've learned it's very unique to a certain type of Christianity that I experienced. So I was evangelical and conservative, and we always would talk about having a personal relationship with God. Was that a concept that was prevalent in your household, or something that you understood to be part of your Christianity? Or
So my family is not very religious. I mean, they are very superstitious. But my grandfather is the most devoted person. Let's say he studies a lot of this, but it's sort of an intellectual thing more than anything else. I would say it's just like a misguided sort of, it's an intellectual interest gone the wrong way.
mm-hmm.
It's not so much about, he wasn't very proselytistic at all, and this was not important in our family, like respecting rituals. Nothing of that was really important in my family at all.
Didn't really practice like rituals, is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's basically like almost a pseudo-scientific worldview. So it's not very ritualistic, it's not very traditionalist, it's not so not so ideological, I guess.
Yeah. I always think of the term cultural Christian, like cultural Catholic. Just, it's part of the culture. It's not a real serious, You're not super devout, but you consider yourself Catholic or Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I believe, according to them, also Jesus is the most advanced spirit, because there's the prophets of the great religions, they're all advanced spirits who are higher or who are together with God or something like that, who didn't fall as far as us, or who fell and managed to join God again. And they come to help us and to send us a message. And they send the message in the way that is easiest to absorb by the people in the culture where they are. So they would say, they would claim things like, the message of every religion is the same, be good and love God, and you will go back to him. And no matter where you go, all religions have the same central message. So it's all basically messengers of the same God who came to.
Wow, so that's really, really loose theology. Well, compared to what I grew up with. But.
Yeah, and I think it's successful in Brazil because of the mixture of religions. Yeah, because unlike the United States, for some reason, here people don't live in small, in segregated communities. Everybody gets mixed, so no matter the religion, the race, everything. I mean, of course, there is a level of segregation. I mean, mostly I would say for historical, socio-economic reasons more than cultural. And I mean, I don't think I've met few people in Brazil who have a commitment to keeping their type of culture or something like that. Even the Jews that I met in Brazil, they were, I guess, would be the community that was most tightly together. Mm-hmm. But even them, I mean, their Jewishness is quite loose also. And out there,
yeah, that's very, it's unique and compared to the American experience. So I'm enjoying kind of hearing the differences, in Brazil. So up to the point when you decided you were spiritual and not Christian, up to that point, what else was significant about your childhood?
So I was fascinated by the paranormal, and I wanted to have, for example, an out-of-body experience. And I wanted to talk to spirits because it sounded awesome to talk to spirits. I mean, if there are people who talk to spirits, I want to be one of those. I mean, it's pretty amazing that if this is possible. I mean, I was surprised that other people weren't just believed and didn't want to try themselves to do these things that are so fascinating. So,
that's funny. Yeah, so you wanted to talk to spirits. When did that go away? When did you stop feeling like that was something you wanted?
So so now this takes me to the conversion story, basically, because this was something I was also in my generation. I have a brother and 3 cousins, and I was definitely the most religious one in the sense that I was the most interested in this. And I went to, so my grandfather had meetings with this sect every now and then, and sometimes we would all go, but sometimes only I would go because I was the most curious, and I was very interested, and I really wanted to. When they told me these things, I was like, I really want to do it. Like I want to fly. Imagine that, coming out of your body and flying around and stuff like that. It's really awesome. And they claimed it was possible. So, my aunt said she did it several times. Like she Like again, even without trying, she would go to bed and she would see her body in the bed, and she would just float, and she would have these experiences and see ghosts and whatever. I thought I saw ghosts too when I was little, and when I told I saw somebody in the bathroom, they would say, yeah, because children are still more connected to the spiritual world. And also children and old people are connected because they are people who just came from the spiritual world and didn't connect to matter so much yet. And the old people who are reconnecting to the spiritual world because they're going to die soon, they have more access to the spiritual stuff like that.
There's some, it's funny, there's some logic to like the
Yeah.
the kind of the subjective beliefs. They've like kind of made
Yeah.
a system. Yeah.
That's an interesting thing because the Spiritists don't value faith so much. I mean, they are unlike Christianity. I would say they are a sort of scientific, like pseudo-scientific, while most Christians that I met, they don't claim that it's a science. They just know it's just revelation, and
Yeah.
we know, and I have faith that this is the case, even if it seems contradictory. I still have faith,
So
out of loyalty to the Bible.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So based on what you said, did people in your family believe that humans existed in the spiritual realm? This is kind of like Mormonism. It makes me think of Mormonism. Like you exist as a spirit and then you come into being on Earth.
Yeah. So there are some layers, like even after there are some Spiritist movies. Actually, I recommend. There is one called Our Home. I saw this one. It's the only one I saw, but it became trendy at one point in Brazil, and there were a couple movies that were made. And it gives you a good overview. Like basically, people die and then they go sort of to another dimension, but they're spirits. And there's this idea too that some people there is a brief period when you die that you become just a spirit still hanging around on Earth. Especially if you were a very material person. That's this idea that if you're very carnal, you will still linger and like be on Earth and refuse to depart. And these are the ghosts that people see, on Earth. Because usually the spirits don't just live here; they go to somebody to another place. But some spirits who are troubled remain on Earth and just hanging around.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating. Well, can you identify a time when you began to doubt your beliefs, the beliefs you were raised with? I think you said it was around, your young teens, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess also I started to feel uncomfortable with some things about when I learned a lot about Jesus. It seemed that there was something too idealistic and not practical about him, and like even the idea of turn the other cheek. I was always kind of, maybe it's sort of aggressive of me, but I was never really bought that. I was like, yeah, but that's kind of self-destructive, isn't it? I felt it was like become too vulnerable. I mean, sure, I appreciate the beauty of the message, and I am quite a pacifist, but there is a limit. And I started questioning these things, and then I realized that like Jesus is not that important to me, and I don't care much about Jesus and stuff. I care more about getting out of my body and having experiences
flying
like
around. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. and then so I started pursuing this, and so on Orchid, the social network, I joined forums about out of body experiences and things like that, and I also went to Spiritist centers in Brazil, and I asked like how to talk to spirits, but they had a weird reaction. It's interesting because back when I went there, I still believed, but they already perceived my questions as skeptical, which was interesting because it was the first time when I realized that people were framing me as skeptical, even though I wasn't my intention at all. And I really wasn't skeptical. I was really just trying to find out. But they almost like perceived it as a confrontation. And so I was like, I want to talk to spirits too. And they knew I couldn't do it. So they were like, no, but it was only some people can do it. And you have to be open to it. If you're too scientific about it, not going to work. You have to be working on a different frame of mind in order to have access to these things. And like everything sounded like an excuse to me, and I was kind of frustrated. And I watched a lot of old documentaries that were on Discovery Channel or whatever about the paranormal. I would watch all of them. And it was always very frustrating, like how there were always the skeptics, and they made a lot of sense. And most of the time, the non-skeptics were just seemed to be looking for excuses to justify their stuff. And I was angry because it's like, and when I realized that this is a big thing, that, I mean, basically it's not mainstream. When I grew up, I had the sensation that everybody believes it, you know, and that it's common sense. But I realized that in some, perhaps, in the academic world, like you couldn't teach in school things like that because it's different from history or science or whatever, because that's proper, let's say, things that you learn. And I was like, well, but if spirits exist, we should learn about it in schools. I mean, if we know that they exist, and if we know all that, it should like be part of the curriculum. Like, it's a very important information. And if there is a source of the spiritual beings who come and tell us how to live our lives and how to be good, should be like, it should be an essential thing that we're learning about.
Yeah, it's so funny. Sorry, this is totally a tangent. I was thinking like I can just imagine like them being in like school trying to teach like, now this is the Queen of the Sea and this is where she lives and this is how old she is and she really likes to do these things, you know. Like, but they don't teach it because it's all pretend. Yeah.
Yeah, and I realized that some people don't believe that, and also it was only really when I started traveling and meeting people that I realized how specifically Brazilian this whole thing is. I don't know, perhaps in other places in Latin America it's similar. I don't know. But
you know, real quick, something that's interesting. Yeah? Sorry, I keep interrupting you. I'll stop. But about 30-40 minutes from where I live, in like the Pacific Northwest of the United States, there is a lady, and she calls this, you were talking about someone who, like a spirit speaks through them, and I think she calls her the spirit Ramtha, I think is what they call it. But she has this like huge like property and like a really nice house and stuff, and she lives there, and she teaches people like that this spirit talks through her and talks through her and teaches them things. And that sounded very similar. So it's funny is like when you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, that's so unique. And then that popped in my head. I'm thinking, well, you know, we're all kind of the same. I mean, it's just, you just have to find it, you know?
This exists in the U.S. too, this mysticism. It's called, I don't know, it's New Age.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it, New Age.
Even the movie Ghost, it's kind of similar. It has some of these ideas that there are spirits who are lost in the between worlds. He'll stay here, and they have to kind of accept their death and solve their unsolved stuff on Earth before they can go to the other dimension. But in the case of Ghost, it was a more typical heaven or hell, more binary thing. And I don't know, there are some horror movies too. They have a lot of this stuff. But every movie about haunted houses, and you know that game that you play, I don't know, there's a board and then you talk to spirits.
Oh yeah, a Ouija board.
Yeah, so there are like, even there's another exorcism movies, American movie. There's also that movie, what's the name? I forgot. With Nicole Kidman. With ghosts in a house, and The Others is the Nicole Kidman movie that I mentioned, and even the movie Sixth Sense movie.
Oh yeah, Sixth Sense, yeah.
And they have these elements too, you know. And for Brazilians, those things that people actually believe. I don't know about the United States. I mean, but I have this feeling that even in Brazil, for example, there are the evangelical Christians too, who are much more hardcore and like, no, this is all. Like that. What the interesting thing to me is that they reject it not by saying that it's just untrue and they're just deluding themselves. They don't say that. They say it's witchcraft. So in the end, they believe, right? So I don't know, how is it in the U.S.?
They believe it's a thing. It's just the wrong thing, right?
Exactly.
I think it's similar, actually.
Yeah.
I think Christians, like, I grew up feeling like all the other gods were demons, or they were Satan tricking us. Like Allah might be like, I don't know. I think it depends on the Christian you talk to, but I think some of these other gods were viewed as like they were demons, or they were Satan impersonating a god and he was tricking people. So there's a belief in the spiritual world and in this active, like, kind of fight between good and evil and deceiving and all that. Yeah. So I think there's some similarities, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are some African religions like Umbanda or Candomblé that are where they actually worship the gods and they accept them. But even these religions have mixed so much with Christianity that most people, at least the people that I know, even the people who embrace the African religions, they will say that, no, but there's only one God. These other ones are like, they're not so important. They're like, they're advanced spirits. They are spirits that communicate with us and who maybe help us communicate with God, but they are not gods.
Yeah. Well, I kind of got us off track with a couple of tangents, but you were talking about questioning, and people were calling you, like acting like you were confrontational when you just had questions. So kind of following that line of, or that train of thought, when did you begin to realize that you weren't buying into it anymore? Or when did you have serious doubts?
It's a good question. It's difficult. I mean, I started abandoning so many things. I think it would also be relevant to mention that at some point I stopped believing in the devil. I think that was the first specific thing that I stopped believing in. And I don't remember a specific reason. I guess I just started studying and watching documentaries and learning about history and all sorts of stuff. And it just started feeling so childish to believe in the devil. And I realized that so many of the bad things that happened that we didn't know how to explain, we just said, that's the devil. But I still believed in, so I was like, I don't buy that. It's just ridiculous. And I don't know, I was 15 or even less. I was 14. Yeah, I don't know. I was about 13, 14 when I started challenging these first beliefs. But I still believed in God. Like, I was still saying, well, God might exist, like the creator, but perhaps not a good God. And then there was the problem of evil. That was the thing that bugged me the most, I think. I was very outraged and annoyed by all the evil that happens, and when people mention God, like, thank God that, I don't know, this kid, that was like, I don't know, a huge disaster, 100 people die, and then there's this kid that survives, and they're like, God saved this child. It's like, what? How does that make any sense? Like, what about the other 100 people who died? They don't matter. It's just this kid.
It's a very self-centered view.
It's very weird. I mean, I didn't buy that at all. So it's like, maybe God exists. I thought back then that maybe God exists as a creator, because I couldn't understand how everything could come into being, but probably an indifferent creator, because clearly we have very different senses of right and wrong. I mean, God seems to find it a problem to kill hundreds of people in a natural disaster, and we find it a problem.
Wow. Well, when you were having some of these doubts and your beliefs were changing, were you talking to anyone in your family or anyone that was close to you?
I talked to my parents, perhaps a bit. My brother, mostly, I guess. We kind of went through this together to some extent. Although I was more interested than him, but I talked to him, and I talked to my mom. Is just the type of, she doesn't care at all. So she's like, if I would have any question about anything religious, she was like, I don't know and I don't care.
That's so funny. But so was your father more religious then?
No, but he was more intellectual a bit, so he would maybe have he would think more about it, but mostly what people would do is like talk to a grandfather. That's basically what people would say. Everybody in my family. And I would go and talk to him. And so he was the most present person in these cases. But at one point I stopped buying his arguments, so I didn't trust him so much anymore. Because he still believed in, I started noticing that there were stuff that he believed in that I just didn't. So or at least I still believed in them, but I wasn't buying his arguments anymore. And then I started looking on the internet. I think the internet also helped. And yeah, you mentioned, so even at one point, I guess, I remember I changed my profile on Orchid from spiritual but not religious to agnostic, because it was like, I'm very unsure about God, but I still believe potentially in a spiritual world. And it's interesting because my family, the arguments they would use is like, but this story and this story. And they would tell stories about people who communicated with spirits. Like, how could they have known that if they hadn't talked to a spirit? You know, they would have. And indeed, if I assume that the story is true, then it's impossible. They couldn't have known. But certainly, like, the story had been distorted already at some point. It was difficult because I didn't want to be an asshole and just doubt people's experience. But the thing is, yeah, people fool themselves, or they have their own biases, and when they remember a story, it's not really exactly that story. Even if they remember very vividly, they feel it very vivid. If you have no mechanism to check, you can kind of fantasize a lot. We are vulnerable to that. And I guess when I stopped believing even in the spiritual world, that was when I kept trying to have out-of-body experience and stuff like that. And at one point, after all this skepticism, I was kind of losing my energy. Then there was a guy who posted in a forum about, I have a number, a piece of paper in my house with a number. Here's my address. You can come here, the out-of-body experience, and read the number. And if you get the number right, I will send you, like, I don't know, 1,000 reais, like $1,000 or whatever. And the people started saying, no, but it doesn't work like that, because I don't know, some people would say that it's another dimension, that you're not in the physical world anymore, these things don't matter. Or there was at least one guy who just tried, like, a number, but I guess he was joking. I don't think he actually.
So this guy was willing to pay someone who could like guess.
Yeah, he was a skeptic and he was making fun, I guess. And when I saw everybody's reaction and how nobody could do it and people were coming up with excuses and whatever, I guess this was quite a critical point. Actually, yeah, it's interesting. I don't even know this guy, and it's the internet, the good thing about the internet. So that day, like, when I followed the discussion for a while, and I was like, this guy is right. I mean, people they're not able to defend what they say they do, but they really probably don't do it. And it makes, so I realized this is, and then I guess everything started falling apart at that point. Like, everything was like, if this is, how come it's so mainstream to believe all that? And then it's when I started reading about science. It's like, how can you confirm? How can you know that you're not? Because I did have experiences at some point of sort of lucid dreaming or something like that, and I was like, was that an out-of-body experience? And I was like, I don't know. I had this instinct that I have to somehow confirm in a way that goes beyond my subjective experience, because what's happening in my mind, it could be anything, you know. It doesn't mean necessarily. I couldn't base any metaphysical claims about reality on my subjective experience alone. I have to have it validated by something. I instinctively felt like that. I don't know. And yeah, and I started reading about, I just started wondering, like, am I an atheist and things like that. And I started reading about atheism.
Thanks for joining me for part 1 of my conversation with Ariel. Be sure to tune in for the second half next week.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.